All right, let's talk about Lent and sacrifice from a Catholic perspective. So, starting off, we have our saint of the day, Saint Therese of Lisieux, also called the Little Flower. She was born in Alençon, France in 1873, and then she died in 1897 from tuberculosis. So, she died pretty young. She came from a very faithful family. She was the youngest of five girls. Her mother died when she was a child, and her father doted on her, and her older sisters were the ones that primarily took care of her. Her father had actually at one point discerned becoming a priest, and her mother had discerned becoming a nun. And then they both, for whatever reason, left those vocations and met each other and decided to get married. And they lived out the Catholic faith in their home to the point where all five of their daughters became nuns. That's unheard of for any, even the super holy families. It's unheard of. Her mother died when she was 4 years old, and that deeply impacted her life because she grew up without a mother, and many of members of her family were really overindulgent with her and allowed her to do so many things, basically spoiled her. So, by her own account, she was a very spoiled child, and she had fits of temper tantrums. She would make people feel guilty all around her. She would go into these like melancholic episodes where she would, just not give everyone the silent treatment because she didn't get what she wanted. So this was her entire childhood, and this is her own account of how she was when she was a child. And then around 12, she made her first communion and confirmation, and then she became ill at one point. And during her illness, she really had a conversion experience where she realized that her selfishness, her temper tantrums, her self-absorption were just so bad for her and for everyone around her. And so from that point on, she decides to dedicate her life to pursuing virtue and growing in holiness. And she really starts to pursue the idea of becoming a nun. She's 12 years old. So at the age of 15, she actually was allowed to join a Carmelite convent. And this was no easy task because she had gone to the Mother Superior of the convent, which her oldest sister, had actually already joined. So she went to the Mother Superior and asked if she could join, and the Mother Superior was like, "You're still a kid. Grow up a little bit more, get an education, go get a job in the world, and then come back, and then we'll talk about it." She was so dead set that her and her father took a journey to Rome just to sightsee, make a pilgrimage, but they were granted an audience with the Pope at that time. And as soon as she walks in to see the Pope, she marches up to him and is like, "I want to become a nun, and I want your permission, so that way the Mother Superior will let me become a nun. If the Pope says yes, then nobody will say no to you." He basically gave her the proverbial pat on the head and said, "There, that's very sweet. That's very wonderful that you want to become a nun, but trust in God's will, and God will let you become a nun when you're ready." So that kind of shows how precocious she was. She joined the convent, and she lived a simple, quiet, unassuming life. She did things like mop floors and clean the chapel and cook for the sisters and help train some of the novices that were coming in, like the new nuns that were coming in. And she lived a very quiet, simple life. There was nothing extraordinary about her. She wasn't seeing visions. She wasn't hearing God talk to her in a deep and profound way. Her older sister actually became the head of the convent, and she noticed her younger sister's piety and holiness, and how, even though it was very simple and very quiet, it was extraordinary how deeply devout that she was. So her older sister, as the head of the convent, placed her under obedience and told her, "You will write an autobiography. You will write a journal about your spiritual journey and what your soul is going through." And Therese fought her older sister. She's like, "I don't want to do this." "No, are you kidding me? There's no point in me writing about this. There's nothing special about my life." So she was placed under obedience, though, so she had to do it. And thank God that she did, because she wrote a book called The Story of a Soul. And this book became an overnight instant hit, especially after she died, because she died shortly after she wrote it. This was in her early 20s, early mid 20s. It was an instant hit. It even made its way to the Pope at the time, Pope Pius the 11th, and he loved it so much that he started promoting it everywhere that he could. So this book was profound for Catholic spirituality because it was talking about something that was already present within the Catholic Church. It was already there. Saints were already doing it, but nobody did it or was able to explain it quite like Saint Therese was able to. And we call it the little way of holiness, the little way of perfection. Saint Therese says in her autobiography, she says, I can't do the great feats of the saints from centuries before. I'm probably not going to become a martyr because nobody's killing Catholics in late 1800s France. And I'm not going to be a missionary anywhere. I'm not going to spread your gospel in crazy unknown parts of the world. I am not going to be known for major miracles or being a visionary. So Lord, I can't climb this mountain to you. I want the easiest way to you possible. So I'm going to take my little elevator to you. And so St. Therese has the audacity even to tell God, is like, I'm not going to climb this mountain. I'm going to take the elevator. Thank you. Or the escalator, I think is what she calls it. I'm going to take the escalator. And so her little way that she describes, her little escalator, is by simply living out holiness in day-to-day life, in the little things. When she was mopping the floor, when she was cooking for her fellow sisters, when she was cleaning up her little room, when she was having a difficult moment with her, one of the nuns, she took all of these opportunities and then turned them into prayers. So when she's sweeping the floor, she would offer it up for everyone that walked on that floor. When she was cooking the food, she would offer it up for everyone that would eat the food and for her own holiness. And so turning holiness into something that was day to day, not something that you needed to go out and do heroic acts or great miracles. Just little things, little ways to love God throughout the day and little ways to call him to mind. So that really was needed. It was really needed in her day and age. Her book became an instant hit, and she was canonized as a saint in 1925. That was only 28 years after her death. And then in 1997, Pope John Paul II, now Saint John Paul II, made her what's called a doctor of the church. And if you remember from previous classes, a doctor of the church is someone, man or woman, a saint, who has made a significant contribution to the spirituality, to the tradition, to the growth of Christianity. And so Saint Therese, this little nun who died young of tuberculosis, who only did one great feat, and that was write an autobiography about her life, she became a doctor of the church, an influential heavy hitter for Christian spirituality. Her book, Story of a Soul, is so simple and so good and so accessible. She wasn't a doctor. She didn't have her master's degree in theology. She didn't have, and she can't enter the convent at 15. What kind of education did she have at that time? And so she was educated, but if you read the original documents of her journal, they're filled with spelling and grammar errors. She wasn't an intellectual. She was just a very simple soul. And so her journal is incredibly accessible, is very easy to read, but packs a total punch. And I would say that her journal, Story of a Soul, is a must read for every Catholic. So yeah, that's St. Therese in a nutshell. Her feast day is October 4th, and she's the patron saint of missions and missionaries. And it's interesting that someone who never left her little town in France, the convent that she joined was in her town where she was born and raised. And so she never left her little town in France, but she is the patron saint of missionaries. And that was because she writes very fondly about her desire to go and preach God's word and God's love to far-flung distant lands, but realized that God was calling her to stay where she was. And she carried on incredible correspondence with a lot of different priests that were missionaries in foreign countries, and she was constantly praying for them. So she's now known as the patron saint of missions and missionaries. One of the things that you'll see with Catholic devotions is that there is a novena to St. Therese. And it's a prayer where you're asking her, in a sense, to share her understanding and her knowledge, because she knows God's will, because she's with him in heaven, to share God's plan and God's will for you. And so it's pretty common, if you're facing some kind of life decision, that you'll see Catholics pray a novena to Saint Therese, asking for a sign, if you will, from God about the direction that they should move in their life. And it's pretty common. It seems unrealistic and it seems superstitious, but it's happened too many times in too many incredible ways with people that I know, close friends of mine. It's pretty common to receive a flower, specifically a rose, and sometimes even a specific color. Some Catholics even ask for specific colors of roses, and they get it at the end of the novena. It's kind of odd and strange and wonderful all at the same time. So yes, novenas to Saint Therese, you will see that kind of in Catholic popular piety today, Catholic prayers that you'll see kind of floating around in the world. So that is Saint Therese in a nutshell. So now into our topic of the day, which is the Catholic practice of Lent and how to live it out. We've just recently celebrated Ash Wednesday, and we're now full-blown into Lent and doing our penances and giving up stuff. So what is the history of Lent in a nutshell, and then how do Catholics practically live it out? We've already covered the history of Lent in the liturgical year and church hierarchy class, so please feel free to watch that video if you want an overview of how Lent fits into the whole liturgical church calendar. But for now, you should know that Lent is composed of like different chunks. You have Ash Wednesday starting it off, and then you have 40 days, and I'll talk about the counting of the 40 in a second. You have 40 days of fasting, penance, prayer, and almsgiving. And then that culminates with Holy Week, and specifically the Triduum. The Triduum are the 3 days leading up to Easter: Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Saturday, Holy Saturday, or what we also call the Easter Vigil. And so those 3 days end Lent, and Lent officially ends at the Easter Vigil. And so what is Lent specifically? So it's basically a time where Catholics live 40 days fasting, and in intensified fasting, prayer, and almsgiving. And this tradition developed, it started very early on in the church, leading up to specific days. They would usually fast for a full 24 hours or 48 hours prior to major feast days. And then it got extended into like a week-long period. Holy Week was usually in a time of intensified prayer and fasting. But the tradition of 40 days started to develop by the 5th century. That's when we really see the Catholic Church starting to enter into Lent as we understand it in our modern context. So the tradition of 40 is found in Jewish culture, and it's very significant. You have Noah being in the flood when the rains are coming down. He's in the flood for 40 days, and then it's another 40 days of sailing on the waters without seeing land. So he's there for a total of 80 days. But you see Noah in the flood for 40 and 40. When Moses was receiving the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, he was on the mountain for 40 days. The Israelites, after they transgress God's law, break the commandments, and start worshiping other gods, right after they leave Egypt and right after God has saved them, God says, okay, you need some time to think about what you've done wrong. Here's a very holy timeout. That timeout lasted for 40 years, worst timeout ever. But the Israelites were in the desert wandering for 40 years before being allowed to go into the promised land. And then Elijah fasted for 40 days as well, as he was trying to prophesy and cleanse Israel of the pagan rituals of his day and age. And then Jesus himself set the tempo for us before beginning his ministry, his public ministry. He went out into the desert for 40 days where he was tempted by Satan. And usually Lent starts off with a reading of that account of Jesus going into the desert for 40 days. So looking at these Old Testament references, these 40 days all have some similarities, and we kind of absorb all of them into our understanding of Lent. With Noah, you have kind of like a cleansing from sin, the sin that has burdened the world. God is cleansing the world of sin with a good divine washing. You have Moses receiving God's commandments open-heartedly and wholeheartedly, unreservedly, being ready to do anything that God asks of him. And he's on the mountain for 40 days receiving the law from God. You have the Israelites in the desert who have gone astray, and they need to turn their hearts back. They need to convert again to God. And then you have Elijah, who's getting ready to, in a sense, proclaim the word, to proclaim God's truth to the Israelites who are fighting against him. But he's, in a sense, preparing himself to enter into this divine battle, if you will. And then you have Jesus, who's getting ready to go begin his ministry as the Messiah to the chosen people. And he prepares himself for 40 days of fasting and prayer in the desert. And so Catholics look at all of these references in Scripture to 40, and we try and take some of those into Lent with us. We focus on letting go of sin, bringing in a greater and deeper adherence to God's will for us in our lives, God's law, which I like to think of that as like truly making sure that my adherence to the relationship that God is proposing to me is good. And that this preparation is for something that it's not meant to just end at Lent. It's supposed to be preparing me for something in the way that it prepared Elijah and Jesus. It prepares me to go out and preach what happens at the end of Lent, the resurrection. Lent prepares me to preach the resurrection to the world that so desperately needs to hear good news, that redemption and hope and love are possible. So Catholics absorb all of those ideas into Lent with those stories in mind. Now, keep in mind that the periods of fasting and abstinence were always observed in the church, and this is nothing unique to Christianity or Catholicism. There are so many different world religions that have periods of fasting and abstinence, from Buddhism to Hinduism to Islam with their Ramadan, which is closely parallels what Catholics do for Lent. And yeah, it's just a very part of, I think it's very closely tied to human nature to go through a period of cleansing and purging the stuff that's built up in your life and simplifying your life and getting back to the essentials. So let's talk about the counting of Lent. Lent begins on Ash Wednesday for Roman Catholics. Byzantine Catholics, most Byzantine rites, to my knowledge, begin on the Monday before Ash Wednesday. So they actually have a different starting time, and they actually have a different counting system than Roman Catholics do. So Roman Catholics begin on Ash Wednesday, and depending on who you talk to, Lent goes either until the beginning of Holy Week or the Wednesday of Holy Week. So Lent, if you count out 40 consecutive days on a calendar, you'll notice you end sometime before Holy Week. And that is also because Roman Catholics do not include Sundays in the counting of the 40 days. And the theology behind this and the practice behind this is that we spend 40 days in fasting and prayer, and with a greater emphasis on Fridays being the day of crucifixion. And so we commemorate the crucifixion of Christ in a small way every Friday. But if we commemorate the crucifixion, we need to celebrate the resurrection. So there needs to be a little celebration every week in Lent on Sundays. And so you'll meet Catholics from all walks of life that have different takes on what this means in terms of their own individual practice. And that is, some Catholics like to just go cold turkey with whatever they're giving up for Lent and go the whole time until Easter, and they don't touch it at all. Other Catholics will take a break on Sundays, a small break. It's not like a full-blown binge on whatever they've been giving up. It's like, no, I'm going to celebrate a little today. It's still a Sunday in Lent, but it is a Sunday. And so you'll meet different Catholics that talk about it in different ways and practice it differently. Just know that the church actually allows either practice. They don't have a strong preference to either. That you can go cold turkey. That's actually easier in many ways, just to give it up for 40 days and say, I'm not touching it. It's actually a little bit harder to break the fast once a week and then try and re-enter into it every week. So the church doesn't really have a preference either way. They do have some other preferences about how you keep the fast during other times of the week, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that wraps up kind of like the history of Lent. So some of these terms have come up as I've been talking here, but there are definitely some Lenten practices that every new Catholic should be aware of, and even seasoned Catholics may or may not be aware of them. So first in Lent, the first thing that you need to be aware of is that there are 2 days minimum required for fasting by the Catholic Church. In the Roman Catholic Church, those days of fasting are Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. All Roman Catholics are obliged to fast on those days. There are some age restrictions and exceptions, and we'll talk about those in a second. But days of fasting are Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. So Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, we are allowed to eat. I'm going to give you, it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, but I'm going to give you the bare minimum, because everybody likes to know what's the least that we need to do. Give me concrete instructions on what I have to do. And so there's a letter of the law, but then we should be striving to follow the spirit of the law. And so Ash Wednesday and Good Friday fasting, according to the letter of the law, says that we are allowed to have 1 full meal that day, and then 2 smaller meals that do not equal together a full meal. So basically the way I like to think of it is 1 full meal and 2 snacks, and then no snacking throughout the rest of the day. So those are the days of fasting required by the church. Days of abstinence are another addition to the fasting. Abstinence means that you're refraining from a certain thing. Fasting means that you're not eating. Abstaining means that you're allowed to eat, but you're not eating a specific thing, or you're not doing a specific activity. And so days of abstinence for Catholics are every Friday in Lent, and we are not supposed to eat meat. This is for Roman Catholics in the United States. This changes by culture. Bishops are allowed to decide what their congregation is going, like it's the idea that we're all in this together, so we're all going to be fasting from this one thing together. We're all going to be abstaining from this one thing together. And so for Roman Catholics in the United States, and for much of Western Europe, and for much of the world actually, it's abstaining from meat on Fridays in Lent. Now, both of these things are taken very seriously by the Catholic Church, the days of fasting and the days of abstinence. So Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and then all Fridays of Lent. Because this is one of the only times of the year where the church says, we, all of us, are doing this together, and everyone needs to be on board. So because this is one of the few things of the year that the church actually mandates, and if you actually pause and think about it, it's not that much. Out of 365 days in the year, we have to leave ourselves a little bit hungry 2 days, and we can't eat meat on like 6 days. Not that big of an ask. And so the church actually takes this pretty seriously, and it is considered a sin if you eat meat on Fridays without good cause, or if you don't participate in the fasting without good cause. And so depending on who you talk to, some priests consider it a mortal sin to not fast on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and to eat meat on the Fridays of Lent. Some priests go as far to say that it is a mortal sin. Some priests don't. Some priests say that it's a venial sin, but they still call it a sin. I am in the camp, me personally, this is my personal opinion, I am in the camp that says that it borders on a mortal sin, because it is one of the rare times where the church is very concrete in what it's asking us to do, and for us to just flippantly ignore it, or to not pay attention to it, and to not ground myself in the tradition that everyone else is participating in, and not taking it seriously enough to try and remember, it's kind of a big deal. in my mind, like that's like God's approaching me and saying, hey, Jessica, I want you to just like participate in suffering with me for these days. And me just being like, I'm not going to take it that seriously. So before I go too far down that line, though, I do want to make clear a couple of exceptions. So there are exceptions to fasting and abstinence. So let's go over those. Abstinence, abstaining from meat, the church does say that that is required for anyone over the age of 14 and under the age of 65. So there are age limitations. The church does recognize that a growing body does not need to be deprived of any kind of specific food. However, I will say that growing up as in a Catholic family, I was encouraged to not eat meat like that. It was just something that we always did. My family had fish sticks or fish or tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches on the Fridays of Lent. It wasn't like I was deprived of food or anything. I had plenty to eat. It was just vegetarian that day or pescatarian. And so the church does make the allowance, though, for children under a certain age and older people over a certain age to not have to abstain from meat on Fridays of Lent. The same is true for fasting. The fasting requirement is actually a little bit older. It's 18 and older and 65 and younger. And so if you're under the age of 18, you do not need to follow the fasting requirements on Ash Wednesday or Good Friday. However, again, growing up in a Catholic family, what we practiced growing up was that I wouldn't snack on those days. Like I may have had 3 meals, and they may have been smaller meals. Especially as I got into my later teen years, I did take it very seriously, and I did fast on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, which Ash Wednesday made school hard. Like I was hungry, I was like losing focus, but it was still like good for me to push past the limitation of my body and be like, no, I'm still going to try and do my best today. And if I really needed something, I would eat something small. But so the church makes allowances and it makes exceptions for people who have age restrictions or age limitations. The other common question that I get is from people that have like high blood sugar or low blood sugar, especially the hypoglycemic people, who, if their blood sugar starts to drop, or if you have like diabetes or something, or if you're undergoing medical treatment, or if you're pregnant, all those types of exceptions, like if you have a medical condition or if you're pregnant, the church absolutely says you do not need to fast and you do not need to abstain from meat. So the church is completely reasonable and doesn't push people beyond their limitations, especially if those limitations are medical in nature. The church is not unreasonable in its expectations for fasting and abstinence, but it does even encourage pregnant women, people that are suffering from some kind of disease that affects their ability to eat or not eat. The church does say, please have another form of penance ready to go. So a coworker of mine is actually pregnant this year, and she just refrained from putting any kind of sweetener in her drinks and tea. Like she was either drinking water or unsweetened coffee or unsweetened tea, and that was penitential for her. But she didn't refrain from eating. Like she still ate because she's got a growing baby. So the church being completely reasonable in its expectations. And if you ever have a question about what is acceptable or what's not, especially in your own personal situation, you feel like it's going to be too much of a struggle, just pull aside a priest. Any priest would be more than happy to answer these questions, and they're usually a pretty quick answer. So if you're ever confused, just talk to your priest, email me, like you know where to find me. Just reach out and someone will be able to advise you on what's best for you. The fasting restrictions and the requirements and the abstinence requirements are there to help us grow in holiness, not to be this tremendous burden or hurdle that we have to hop over that actually hinders my relationship with God. So that's that. Now let's talk about other Lenten practices beyond the fasting and abstinence. So it should be a common practice within the Catholic Church. It actually isn't. Another pet peeve of mine. I have a lot of pet peeves surrounding Lent, but Catholics should all be taking up some kind of prayer, an intensification of your prayer, an intensification of fasting outside of Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. Typically that manifests in kind of like abstaining from certain types of foods. You'll hear a lot of Catholics will give up, chocolate or coffee, or they'll give up sugar in their drinks. They'll you hear Catholics talk about what they're giving up for Lent. So that falls under the fasting piece. So you have prayer, fasting, and then the third part is almsgiving. And the idea is that we fast from things so that we are freeing up time, emotional energy, emotional, spiritual, psychological space. We create space by fasting from something so that we can give that time, that space, that energy, that emotion, the money. Like if I'm giving up Starbucks for Lent, I don't even drink Starbucks, but if I were giving up my weekly Starbucks habit and I'm saving myself $6 a week on coffee, I would take that money and do something with it. Or if I'm freeing up time because I gave up Netflix, that time that's been given back to me from giving up that habit is now being given towards something else. So fasting from so that you can give for. So that's huge in Lent, is the idea that I'm depriving myself of something, but that something should be freeing me up to give somewhere else. And to facilitate that, to grow in my charity, my love for God and love of neighbor, I need to enter into prayer. It's a pretty common understanding that fasting without prayer and almsgiving is just a diet. Let's be real. Fasting, when it's attached to prayer and almsgiving, transforms your soul. Almsgiving without fasting and prayer is just me giving to another charity organization. There's no, like, it might make me feel good in the moment, but I wouldn't say there's the same spiritual depth of change and growth that's taking place as when almsgiving is attached to prayer and fasting. So, all three of these, we like to think of these as like a three-legged stool, and that if you pull one away, the other two just aren't effective. They don't work. So a true Lent, a good Lent, is lived with some kind of intensification of prayer, refraining from something beyond the minimum of what the church is asking of us, and then giving of my time or my money or my resources to somebody that needs it. So some ideas of that, like taking up a new form of prayer or intensifying your prayer, like adding to a prayer time. Instead of praying for 10 minutes, I'm going to pray for 15 minutes every day. I'm going to pray morning prayer every morning at 7 a.m. That's actually what I'm doing for Lent. I'm making sure that I am up at 7 a.m. every morning and I'm praying morning prayer. And giving my prayer life a habit, habitual prayer, and making it something that my schedule revolves around my prayer, not the other way around. And so taking on a new form of prayer, maybe going to daily mass once a week outside of Sunday mass if you don't have the habit of going to daily mass. Maybe it's taking a walk around your neighborhood and praying a rosary instead of listening to your favorite playlist. That there's a great example of fasting and prayer combined. Like, okay, I'm going to take my daily walk, or I'm going to go for my daily run, and I'm going to throw in my headphones and listen to the rosary, or I'm going to listen to a Catholic podcast, or I'm going to listen to a spiritual audiobook instead of like playlist or whatever other fun thing I like to do when I'm doing my activity. So those are just some ideas. Almsgiving, it can be money. It doesn't have to be. Some ideas for almsgiving are, if you're giving up if you're giving up coffee for Lent and you usually buy a coffee, like take that money and put it aside and give it to a charity that you're passionate about, especially a religious charity. Find a convent, find Catholic charities, or find a group that's doing mission work in a third world country, feeding the starving in a third world country, or feeding the starving in our own country. You could and take that money and use it to help a relative that's struggling financially, and just say, here, happy Easter, I'm going to give this to you. Like, here's my coffee money from the last 40 days. Other things that you can do are, this is something that I've seen done pretty well, is that people buy like a $5 or $10 gift card, one for every week of Lent, and they make it their goal that they have to give away that gift card, one gift card a week to someone. That $10, they need to give that $10 gift card to King Soopers, Safeway, Walmart, whatever it is. They need to give away a $10 gift card every week. That's totally doable. So yeah, you're paying attention to God tapping you on the shoulder and saying, like, this person is the one who needs this money. So these are just some basic ideas of money related. Other ideas are giving of your time, like calling that lonely relative that you haven't talked to in the last year or two, striking up a conversation with an old friend that you've kind of like, your friendship has kind of fallen aside, taking time to meet your literal neighbor, because we need to love our neighbor as ourselves, and that might include our literal neighbor. So do I even know my neighbors, and do I actually have a relationship with them? It could be the next time a coworker needs to unload on you about something, like giving of your time, but making it intentional of like, I am depriving myself of something that I'd rather be doing, but I'm giving you my time freely. So giving of your time, going and volunteering somewhere, helping out at the homeless shelter, helping out in a soup kitchen, helping out with a charity organization, to giving of your time, not just your money, giving of yourself. One thing about almsgiving is that it should hurt a little bit. It should make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. Same with the fasting. The fasting, I should feel discomfort. I don't necessarily need to be starving throughout the whole day unless my body can actually handle it. Maybe you're the type of person that actually can handle being hungry all day. Most people can't. But the idea is that I'm making myself a little bit uncomfortable. And it's same with almsgiving. I'm making myself a little bit uncomfortable, but it's what we do with that discomfort. It's in my discomfort, it should be kind of like a prick on my soul of like, oh wait, yeah, I'm not eating. Why? Because there's something bigger that I'm being fed by. I'm striving to be fed by God's love, by God's grace. I'm giving my money, I'm giving my time, and it actually hurts a little bit. I have to like move things around. I have to figure out what am I going to like deprive myself of, like my coffee, or maybe I buy simpler groceries for the month, or maybe I don't spend this much on, my subscriptions this month, or whatever it is. It should hurt a little bit. Like I feel discomfort in what I'm giving. And it's in that discomfort that I reach out to God and be like, you're the person I'm relying on, not my own power, not my own wealth, not my own time. It's you that I'm relying on. So that's the whole point with prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. You're creating a sense of discomfort within your soul, because in comfort, we don't really seek God all that often, but in discomfort, we do. And so it's creating a sense of discomfort and then reaching out to God in that and saying, please help me grow. Please help me to detach from these things that are making me uncomfortable when they're gone. So some thoughts about Lenten practices. Now, before you start thinking that the Catholic Church is just this massive Debbie Downer and only wants you to ever suffer and give up things and like this is the whole point. No, the whole point is the fasting is not the point. The almsgiving is kind of the point. The prayer is definitely the point. But the fasting is not the point of Lent. The whole point of Lent is actually so that we can feast well at the end of it. You're denying the body in a sense so that you can feed the soul, and training the soul to recognize what's truly good for it by refraining from things that the body doesn't necessarily need. When you're denying the body, you are in a sense exercising control over your body. Your soul is saying, no, I'm in charge. You're able to walk by that plate of cookies and be like, I ain't have one of those. I'm in control, instead of just compulsively reaching and scarfing down the whole plate of cookies. Or it's being able to, one of my things is that I'm imposing a bedtime on myself. It's being able to put down whatever I'm doing when my alarm goes off that says time for bed. It's being able to put it down and say, I don't need to continue to do this right now. My life doesn't hang in the balance. My life isn't hanging by a thread on this activity. I can put it down and I can go to sleep right now, which is going to be good for me. It's good for me to stop, or putting a time limit, or refraining from like video games or TV or radio in your car or something like that. It's like, no, I can live without these things, and these things aren't necessary for my life, and I can rediscover something deeper behind these things. So you're exercising control over the body, and in your sense, your soul is kind of like patting your body on the head and saying, there, I love you so much, but I actually know what's best for both of us, and we're going to do it together. So another point of Lent, with the whole fasting and feasting, is that we are creating good habits and virtue in little things, in the little day-to-day activities, so that the bigger things that we need to have virtue in are easier to do. I've found that when I do something as simple as like fasting from something for a couple of days, all of a sudden that sin that's been clawing at my soul that I have struggled to give up or to let go, after fasting for a few days, I'm like, yeah, I don't need to do that anymore. And it's because my body has less of a say, or there's a healthier relationship between my soul and my body, rather than being a war between the two of like my body or my desires or my sinful inclinations being like, pay attention to me. My soul is now saying, no, I am paying attention to you, and we're going to work on this together. We're going to do this together. So, one other thing to talk about with what to give up and how to give it up. There are 3 different types of things that you can give up for Lent. You can give up something good, you can give up something that's neutral, or you can give up something that's bad. Start off with, if you can give up something bad, do it. That's always a given in Lent. If there is some sin holding you back, or if there's some kind of habit that's just like breaking you on the inside, there's no question. That's what you give up for Lent. If it's alcoholism, or if it's some kind of addiction over here, or if it's a really unhealthy attachment to X, Y, or Z thing, give it up. Give it up. That's a no-brainer. Then there's also giving up something that is morally neutral. And this is actually what most people end up giving up for Lent, is like, no, I'm going to give up chocolate. I'm going to give up coffee. I'm going to give up Netflix and other forms of entertainment that borders on being neutral or bad, depending on what you're watching, what you're listening to. So like music and things like that. So if you're watching things that are not good for your soul, no brainer, give it up. If you're watching things like The Great British Baking Show, that's a moral neutral. You can give that up. But it's again, what's the point of giving up something that's morally neutral, neither good nor bad? It means that no, I don't need this in my life, and I'm just exercising control over my body. I'm exercising control over my desires, that I don't need to give in to every desire that I have. So now, what about giving up something that is actually morally good, something that is actually essential for me? We actually see this on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. The church is asking us not to eat. Food is good for my body. My body needs food in order to function. My blood sugar needs to remain at a certain level in order for me to think clearly, in order for me to have energy, in order for me to be a nice person. So what's the whole point of giving up something that's good? Something that is good for me on a physical level? It's showing me, again, it's demonstrating that my soul needs to have a greater reliance on God. That even these things that are good for me mean nothing without Him. Food means nothing if I don't have God. Jesus even stares at the devil who says, turn these stones into bread, you're starving. Come on, you're God, you can do it. Jesus even retorts back, man shall not live on bread alone, but every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. Giving up something that is good for you is also a possibility in things like looking at things that you can give up. So like just some simple things that the church considers, like giving up something good, giving up something neutral, or giving up something bad. Always give up the bad thing. So now some other things to consider with fasting and feasting is the rule of charity. So no matter what we give up, with the exception of abstaining from meat on Fridays and fasting on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, those are the two that are like unbreakable. You can't break those. But with your own personal fast, with whatever you decide to do, we do have something called the rule of charity, that if someone, without knowing what I'm fasting from, like I go over to a friend's house for dinner and they don't know that I've given up desserts for Lent. And they know my favorite dessert is tres leches cake. And they make me a beautiful tres leches cake. And they're like, Jessica, we made this just for you because we knew you were coming over tonight. Please have a piece. Do I sit there and tell them, no, I gave it up for Lent. I can't possibly. When they went through all that trouble, like trying to show me love by making me a cake, I should eat it. That's the rule of charity within Lent, is that if someone does something for me out of love for me and out of love for them, I should do it. I should have it. So keep that in mind, that whatever you give up, if someone is trying to love you through that thing that you gave up, it is not charitable. It is not good to sit there and say, no, I can't possibly, I'm fasting from this. No, you should have it to show love to your neighbor. Yeah. And then the whole point of fasting is so that we can feast well. After Ash Wednesday, nothing tastes better than food. After fasting from like chocolate for all Lent, that bar of chocolate is going to taste amazing on Easter Sunday. That Cadbury egg, so good. But the thing is, one of the beautiful things about fasting is that I've now almost hit a reset button on my soul, that now I'm able to approach the thing and appreciate it and enjoy it without necessarily overindulging. You know what it's like after having starved yourself for a little while and then you gorge yourself on something, you're going to make yourself sick. And so moderation is kind of built into fasting. You bring it back into your life, but now you have a healthier relationship with the thing itself that you've given up, even if it's a good thing. If it's a good thing, you have more gratitude for that thing because that thing's not necessarily a given. If it's a moral neutral, you just have a deeper appreciation and a sense of moderation of how to use it well. So again, the whole point of fasting is feasting. The whole point of Ash Wednesday through Holy Week is so that Easter Sunday can happen and that we can celebrate the resurrection with joy, with detachment from sin, with more control over my soul and my body, so that the whole point is so that I can take possession of myself, that I have self-possession, that I own myself. It's not that bad habit that owns me. I'm not determined by this wound or that sin. I determine me, so that I can then hand myself over to God. It's that dynamic that's taking place over Lent. It's this huge, desperate grasp for self-possession so that I can hand myself over to the risen Christ on Easter Sunday. That's the whole point of Lent. And then I can rejoice and feast well with him in the resurrection. Now, after that incredibly joyful thought, let's go on to something a little bit more depressing, and let's talk about sacrifice. Great transition there. But the whole point of Lent is entering into a spirit of sacrifice, a spirit of suffering. And I think it's really helpful at this moment to sit and think about what the Catholic Church actually teaches about suffering and how suffering actually helps us grow. One of the biggest objections that I hear about Christianity is the theodicy question. Why would a good and all-powerful and all-loving God allow suffering or permit suffering? And I think that while God does not enjoy suffering at all, he does not want us to suffer, there is good that can be drawn from it, that God does not allow the suffering and the sacrifices that we make in our lives to destroy us. He instead turns them into opportunities for growth, for maturity, for blessing, for grace. He can give us that blessing and that grace without the suffering, but sometimes that suffering and that grace sometimes that grace and that love and that maturing come through the suffering and come through the sacrifices. So I want to talk about sacrifice and then some different types of suffering that I've noticed that can maybe shed some light into your own personal spiritual life. So breaking down the word sacrifice, it comes from two Latin words, sacre and facere, which means to make holy. And the word holy itself is kind of an odd word in the English language because we don't quite have a good translation for it. It means something that is completely other, something that is God, actually. God is the only one that is holy. God is the only one that is completely different and other than me. So the word sacrifice means that which makes me like God. It's an interesting concept, and I actually think that our modern English connotation does not carry that at all when we talk about sacrificing. When we think about sacrificing, we think about these passive aggressive, mothers in TV shows. Or, do you know how much I've sacrificed for you so that you can succeed? Or you have all of these people that have made major sacrifices to get where they are today. We think of sacrifice purely in the terms of the negative, but I actually think the original meaning of the word, while negative, also is something incredibly positive. To make me like God means that I have to leave behind something, the things that are holding me back from God. And so there is like a sense of detachment, a sense of letting go, a sense of loss, but it is to achieve something even greater, something even more perfect, more good, more loving, more pure. And so there's a sense of purification, a sense of letting go, so a pain in that, but a pain for the sake of something greater. And that's even true in our modern usage of the word. Like, think of all the things I've sacrificed to get where I am today, the lesser things that have held me back from achieving my dream or whatever it is today. Some sacrifices are difficult, but not all of them. Not all sacrifices have to be hard. It's all in our approach, and it's all in our understanding of what the point of sacrifice is. And I hope in the next couple of minutes we'll be able to see that if I change my understanding of suffering and sacrifice, and I change my perspective, I might have a healthier sense and be able to approach sacrifice and suffering with more joy and more acceptance of it, and being able to look at it in a healthier way rather than something that's going to tear me down and break me down. So in the Old Testament, sacrifices were only done by the high priest and the priests. There was only one group of people that was allowed to do sacrifices. This comes after the time of Moses. Prior to Moses, any male was allowed to offer sacrifices to God. Then the Israelites lost that capability when they started worshiping the golden calf after God gave them the 10 Commandments, and Moses comes down and they're worshiping a golden calf. That's actually when all of the Israelite people lose their priesthood, the ability to offer sacrifices. And God takes it away and says, well, you misused your ability to sacrifice, and so now I'm going to give it to one tribe, the Levite tribe. In the Old Testament, a sacrifice was offered as a symbol of what it was the life force of an animal being poured out. And that life force of an animal was a symbol of your own life being given over to God in a covenantal way. And so you had this animal representing what you desired would happen within you. Now, with the New Testament, with Jesus being the perfect and true sacrifice on the cross, that's a whole realm of theology for another time. But Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. We no longer need animal sacrifices. We no longer need the symbol when we have the completion right in front of us. But what Jesus establishes for each of us is that now I am able to offer sacrifices on my own behalf, and those sacrifices can be internal or external, depending on what I need, and I don't need an animal to sacrifice to do it. I can just do something in my own life, and that actually transforms my soul. It actually has an impact and can make me more like God and solidify the covenant that I have with my baptism, in my baptism with God. So sacrificing in the Old Testament was symbolic of what was going to happen in the New Testament with Jesus on the cross and the giving the power to unite myself to his sacrifice on the cross. So in order for this to happen, I need to take my sacrifices and unite them to Christ's on the cross. And what does this look like concretely? It simply means that when I understand and when I realize that I'm going through some kind of suffering or some kind of sacrifice and doing something, for me personally, I actually concretely have an image in my mind of Jesus on the cross and me, in a sense, giving this to him. or uniting myself to him on the cross. Kind of like how the thieves, the two thieves were on either side of Jesus. I almost imagine myself of like, okay, Lord, this thing is hurting me so much that I feel like I'm dying in a certain spiritual sense, or I feel like part of me is dying, or part of me is deeply hurting. And so sometimes I imagine myself in a way on a cross with Christ. And so those are some imperfect, like I know that these aren't perfect ways to enter into the spirit of sacrifice and offering up my sacrifices with Jesus, but those are some concrete ways that have helped me when I look at my own sufferings and saying, okay, Jesus, you're the one who offers the perfect sacrifice to the Father, and there's no way that I can offer my sacrifice without going through you. So here, I'm with you, and here's my little sacrifice with your big one. Can you please just sneak it in there? So it's some theology, some loose spiritual theology on the spirit of sacrifice. So now let's look into different types of suffering as I have seen and noticed them in the world. When looking at suffering, I have found different analogies, especially as it relates to the life of a child, since we are all God's children. I find that analogies work best with trying to understand different types of suffering that we experience in our lives, and then turning it into a way that we can understand how God is going to work in our lives with suffering, and the fact that God and suffering will coexist, and that God will actually bring greater good out of my suffering. So the first type of suffering I want to talk about is the stove. Imagine you're a parent and you have a small, precocious child that likes to touch everything in sight, especially hot, shiny things. And you tell them, please don't touch the stove is hot. And let's even imagine for a second that your child understands the word hot. It's not that they're ignorant of the word. They're not stupid. They've had an experience of hot before. But you tell them that's going to hurt you. Please don't touch it. But this child is stubborn and just wants their own way, and they keep moving towards that object. At some point, there will come a time when you might, as a parent, take a step back and say, I've told you, and I've told you, and I've told you. And short of putting you in a straitjacket and tying up your hands, I'm not going to always and forever be able to stop you from touching the stove. At some point, you're going to have to learn for yourself that's going to hurt. And so some parents actually take a step back, and what happens? The child touches the stove. Are they hurt? Are they suffering? Absolutely. Did the parent do everything in their power to teach their child without controlling and manipulating and forcing their child, but to teach their child, like, this is bad, you shouldn't do this? Absolutely. The parent did everything that they could. This was a good and loving parent. That with all of these analogies, we have to presuppose that this is a perfect and good and loving parent, not a broken, fallen parent who's going to give into the whims of anger and vengefulness and not being there for their child. Let's shove away imperfect views of parents and put up with the idea of the perfect parent in your mind. That's the way these analogies work. So we have a good and loving parent. The child touches the stove. That child is suffering, doing something that the parent fairly warned them against. And it wasn't something that they were completely ignorant about either. And even if they were ignorant, we'll talk about this in a second, how this relates to suffering in our lives. Sometimes even when we are ignorant of something hurting us and we do it, we still get hurt. We still get hurt, even if we don't know that it was going to hurt us. And so this analogy is actually an analogy of the suffering of sin in our lives. God gives us so clearly guidelines for us to follow, that these guidelines make us happy, they make us healthy, they have us in right relationship with God and with each other and with ourselves. Like, these rules that God gives us, these guidelines, these boundaries are there for our good. And if I step over that boundary and I say, no, I really want to touch that stove, God could come in and force me. But is that a good and loving parent, to force your child to do the good all the time? No, that's not good. That's not a good and loving parent. That's a controlling and manipulative parent. So with the analogy of a stove, I touch it and it hurts. But now, to carry the analogy full circle, where is the good and loving parent after the child touches the stove. The parent already knew the object was going to hurt their child, and so what are they ready with? Some burn cream and some Band-Aids. The parent already has them ready. They're in the hand as they're watching their child touch the stove. They have the remedy already ready to go. They have the medication already ready to go because they know what's going to happen. And so it's the same for us when we sin. God already has the remedy and everything ready to go. It's not like he turned his back on us and we touched the stove and he didn't know. No, God knew. God knew the whole time what we were doing. And so God's ready with the remedy. The parent is ready with the remedy, and the parent approaches the child and says, can I put this on you? This is going to make you feel better. This is going to heal that burn. It hurts so bad right now, doesn't it? It really hurts. But here, I can heal it. I can help you make it better. And it might take a little while to heal, but here, let's get it started. Now, a child can have two reactions. They can say, yes, please heal me. And then the parent puts on the burn cream, gives the child a hug and a kiss, kisses the burn and says, here, that'll make it better. Because mommy and daddy's kisses always make everything better. That is so true. I've seen that so many times. There's something about the kiss and the love attached to the kiss of a parent that makes it healing. So in the same way, God, in a sense, kisses our wound that we bring to him, the wound that we've inflicted on ourselves through sin, or the wound that someone else has inflicted on us from their own sin, which I'll talk about later. But God's there, ready, and we can accept it and be like, yeah, ouch, I have an owie. Can you please fix it? Or the child can say, and this happens all the time in the world, you see this, you've maybe even experienced it within your own self. The child may look at the parent and say, you're the one that bought the stove. You're the one that put it here. You're the one that turned it on. You're the one that caused my injury. My burn is your fault. You didn't stop me. It's your fault that I got burned. And so flipping it back now on the parent, on the creator, on the father, flipping the sin back and saying, this isn't my fault. This is your fault. That's exactly what Adam and Eve did in the garden. Adam looked at God and was like, the woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit and I ate it. It's your fault. You gave me this woman. So, and in that, you're breaking your relationship even more. God approaches us with healing. The parent approaches with healing and forgiveness, and we can reject it. So that's one type of suffering, the suffering of the stove. Like when we suffer in sin, when we suffer from things that we inflict on ourselves, the only thing that we can do is turn to God and say, ouch, I hurt, I'm sorry, you told me, you were right, can you please heal me? And so that's the suffering of a stove. The next type of suffering is the suffering of a cookie. So if you are a small child and your parents keep a cookie jar on top of the fridge, and 5 minutes before dinner, you approach your mom and you say, I really want a cookie. Please, can I have a cookie? Your mom's going to say, no, dinner's in 5 minutes. You need to wait till after dinner. Now, if you are a child that really wanted that cookie, what happens? All of a sudden, you are in a full-blown temper tantrum because you really wanted that cookie and mom said no. And so that cookie is an analogy. Is the child suffering in that moment? Absolutely. The child's in utter pain because they can't have what they want. Is the cookie doing anything wrong? Is the cookie something bad for them? Like the hot stove was something that was bad for the child. Is the cookie something that's necessarily like bad for the child? No, the timing isn't the greatest. Now that cookie might be a stove if the child is diabetic, in which case the parent in every way should say no. But let's pretend like for a moment that the child is a normal, healthy child and yeah, they want a cookie. It's a normal thing. It's fine. It's just a cookie. In that temper tantrum, what's happening? That child is suffering. How is that analogous to our spiritual lives and the types of suffering that we experience in our day-to-day lives? It's when we pray for things and we don't get the answer that we want. It's when we pray for those good things in our lives that we see like, yeah, it would be good to have this. It would be good for my neighbor who lost his job to find a new job. It would be great for my cousin to get cured of cancer. It would be great. if Uncle Bob and Aunt Sally didn't get a divorce. Like all of these things, it would be great if someone didn't have that car accident. It would be great if I got a raise. Like all of these good things that we can pray for in our day-to-day lives. And God may not give us the answer we want to hear. And sometimes when I look at it from a child's perspective, like the child that wants the cookie, all I see is the cookie. That's a good thing. But now look at it from the parent's perspective. It could be a whole host of reasons why you would say no to your child to having a cookie. It might be because you've prepared the child's favorite dinner and you're taking them out for ice cream later and you wanted to keep it a surprise because you know that's going to make them happy. And so sometimes we pray for something good and God says, that's great, but I have something better for you. So you got to hold off. I want to give you something better. And then the child can keep throwing the temper tantrum and say, no, I don't want my favorite dinner. And no, I don't want ice cream. I want that cookie. You're throwing God's generosity back in his face. The other thing is that maybe those cookies on the refrigerator in the cookie jar are actually like, I don't know, a trap for rodents. Like maybe you have a rat or mouse problem in the house and the child doesn't know it. And they're actually laced with rat poison. No, you're not going to give the child a cookie. And the child doesn't know that. The child doesn't know that it's actually bad for them. And so it's a good thing that the parent isn't giving them a cookie. And so from the child's perspective, it's God isn't giving me something that I want. I need this and it's good and God needs to do this for me and he's not doing it. Therefore, he's just an angry, petulant God who isn't giving good things. Or it's from God's perspective of like, no, I have great things planned. And sometimes we ask for things that we perceive to be good for us in the moment, but aren't actually good for us overall. And me knowing everything, being omniscient and omnipotent and your creator, I know it's best for you. And so that type of suffering of not getting the answer that we want, it hurts. It hurts a lot to pray for good things and then to have God not come through in the way that we would want him to. But it's a matter of taking a step back and saying, okay, God, that really does hurt actually. Like I wanted you to do this for me and you didn't. Or I wanted you to do that for this person and you didn't. But I still trust that you are good and that you have what's best for me in mind, or you have what's best for that person in mind. One of the things I constantly remind myself when I'm praying for good things and I'm not seeing them happen, especially good things that I know are absolutely essential, like the conversion of friends and family. Like their salvation is the most important thing that I could possibly pray for. There's no better thing that I can ask for. And when I don't see it happen on my timeline in the way that I want it to happen, it's me taking a step back and saying, okay, God, I have to remember that you love them more than I do. And so it's keeping that in mind when we're asking for the spiritual cookie, that God might say no. Sometimes God will say yes. He's like, here, have a cookie. Here, have two. And so sometimes when we ask for the cookie, sometimes God will definitely give it to us because God loves giving us good things. He loves giving us what we enjoy. But sometimes what we enjoy and what we want may not be what's best for us in the moment or best for the other people in the moment. Maybe there's something else that they need to go through or something else that needs to happen in order for them to truly appreciate the good thing that God has for them. So that's the second analogy. First analogy is the stove. Second analogy, the cookie. So now the third analogy is a bicycle, something that is essential for every child's growth and development and maturing is learning how to ride a bicycle, especially in first world countries. You've just got your new bike. Your dad just took the training wheels off and you're getting ready to ride solo for your first time ever. Your dad's running behind you, holding the seat, and you're pedaling as fast as you can go. And then the dad is holding you straight, and then all of a sudden, let's go. And lets you start pedaling on your own. And for a few brief seconds, you are riding high, you are going, and then you eat it. Absolutely, every child does. And every parent, as soon as they take the training wheels off and put their child on that seat and start running behind them, every parent knows that their child is going to get injured learning this new skill. And it's the same for us in the spiritual life. There are times when God wants to teach us a new skill, when God wants us to learn a new lesson, when God wants us to incorporate a new grace or fight against a sin or a vice in our life. And he's putting us on a spiritual bike. Or it's almost like a child that's learning how to walk. If you've ever watched a toddler learning how to walk, you have the parent that's walking kind of like over them, holding two fingers up, and they're holding them, and then all of a sudden the parent goes and pulls the fingers out. And what does the child do? The child stares up at the parents and might take another step and then falls straight down. So with us in the spiritual life, there are times when God wants to teach us a new lesson, when God wants us to learn a new skill, a new virtue, a new grace. But he knows that as we're learning it, we're going to fall. And sometimes those falls really hurt. And a good and thoughtful and all-knowing parent, what do they have ready? They have the Band-Aids ready. They're running up behind you saying, are you okay? Come on, let's get back on that bike and try it again. Come on, let's do it. Let's blow on your knee. Like, let's rub it off. Get the dirt out. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. Let's fix it later. Or let's fix it now. Let's put a Band-Aid on it and let's come back out and try again. And so we can have perseverance and we can have endurance. We can look at our parent or we can look at God and say, yeah, okay, let's keep going. I didn't get it this first time, or I only got it for this long this first time. I only did it for this. Or you could be the type of child that says, you put me on that bike. I got hurt because it's your fault. You created that bike. You bought me that bike. I got hurt because of you. The child isn't wrong. Parent did buy the bike, and the parent did put him on the bike, and the parent knew that you were going to fall. But the falling is for something greater. The falling is for a lesson. The falling is a skill that is being developed. The point of riding the bike isn't so that you fall. It's so that you can ride. It's so that you can go farther distances. It's so that you can be free in the neighborhood and get there faster than before. And so it's the same with virtue. Learning a new virtue takes time. It takes endurance. It takes patience. It takes failure. But the virtue is going to get you to your destination and a healthier and happier relationship with God faster. God knows this, but he knows that as soon as he puts you to the test, you might fall. And it's okay because he's ready. He's there with whatever you need to heal. But now I could be that child that says, I don't ever want to get back on that bike, thanks. I actually don't like riding bikes. I'll walk everywhere from now on. You can get to your destination via walking. Sure. But God's giving us an opportunity to do something better and faster. And I'm turning down that opportunity if I say, I don't like that bike, no thanks. Sometimes we can't ask for the training wheels to be put back on. I've definitely prayed for that. I'm like, Lord, this is a little too hard. Can we go back? Can we take a step down? And can I spend a little bit more time perfecting this before I take the next step up? I mean, that's possible. But to reject a gift of learning something new because of the pain that might be involved in it is only going to hurt us in the long run. So we have the stove, we have the cookie, we have the bike. So now one other analogy is the analogy of suffering through a doctor. So let's say that in the first scenario or the third scenario, the stove or the bike, you touch the stove and you were the angry child that said, no, I don't want you to come near me with that burn on my, you're the one that caused this injury because you let me touch the stove and because you didn't even tell me that the stove was hot. Or you hid your injury. Like maybe you touched the stove while the parent wasn't looking and then you hid it later because you were afraid that you were going to get in trouble. You can carry this analogy out so many different ways and it all works. It all works. Then what happens when you let a burn, let's say it's a 2nd degree burn or a 3rd degree burn that actually causes like some damage to your skin and the underlying tissue and you don't take care of it? Or let's say you fall off the bike and in your anger you say, don't come near me. No, I don't want you to touch it. Let's say you maybe even break your arm when you fall off the bike and it hurts that badly. Or you're climbing a tree in the front yard that your parents told you not to climb and you fall out and you break your arm. You're like, nope, don't touch it. What happens when a wound gets infected? What happens when a bone sets badly and then you finally go to the doctor because you want to be healed? The doctor looks at it and says, this is going to hurt, but you're going to be better soon. It's the same with God and our spiritual injuries, with our spiritual wounds. He looks at them and he's like, some of them, not all of them, but some of them he's like, you've let this one go a while, haven't you? We could have fixed it sooner, but you're here now, so let's fix it now. There's no like, you should have come to me sooner with God. There's none of that. But there is okay, your bone broke, your spiritual bone broke. And now what do you have to do? I have to re-break it and set it properly so that way it heals properly. Or the wound, you have to reopen the wound, scrape out all the infection and the pus. You got to pour on some, antiseptic, and that's going to burn and that's going to sting. So God sometimes comes in as divine physician. God sometimes comes in as healer. And some of our wounds are pretty bad, not going to lie. And I could say, no, don't touch that one ever. Just let it be. Don't touch this one ever. And then walk around with a limp the rest of my life. Walk around with a half-functioning arm. Walk around or worry about the infection getting worse and affecting other parts of my life. You see this with people who have sins that they haven't forgiven themselves for, that bleed into bitterness or anger or frustration or resentment in other parts of their lives. All of a sudden, one sin bleeds into everything else in their life because they don't go to God and get it healed. And so it's the same with us in the spiritual life. Sometimes when we go to God with our wounds and with our healings, God looks at it and he's like, this is going to hurt. You're going to suffer. But are you ready to be healed with me? I'm here with you and it will be healed perfectly. But it's going to hurt. Are you ready? And that's our only response should be, yes, Lord, I'm ready. Let's do this. Let's do this. Please try to make it hurt not so much. Can you give me some Advil before you start? Sometimes God can give us spiritual painkillers. Absolutely. This is in the form of friends, religious experiences, consolations. God gives us tons of painkillers to help the medicine go down and to help the pain ease. But that is definitely part of the suffering in our life is the doctor. So now the last part of suffering that I've seen, and this is a combination of several different types of suffering, and it's probably the least fleshed out in all of my analogies in my own mind. I'm still working on this one. But it's the suffering of a bully. It's when you're not doing anything wrong, but someone decides to come up and bully you. And where are the parents? The parents, when you're young enough, could be helicopter parents and come in and be like, nope, go talk to the teacher, and we're going to get this kid out of the class, and we're going to protect you, we're going to transfer you to school, different schools and things like that. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes God does that. Sometimes God removes us from a situation that is actually harming us, from someone else is actually harming us, and God actually intervenes and stops it. But there are other times, especially when you get older, what do most parents teach their children? And a healthy way to handle a bully, you got to stand up to them. And so sometimes God permits a suffering that's happening at the hands of someone else in our life so that we grow in strength to be able to stand up for what's right and to be able to look at my own dignity and say, no, I don't deserve to be treated this way. And so where is God in all of this? He's watching. He knows that the bully is actually doing the stove analogy. He's telling the bully, he's right next to the bully saying, please don't do this. The stove is hot. And then he's right next to us with the bike analogy saying, okay, we're going to learn a new lesson here, and this is going to hurt, and I'm ready as the doctor to heal any wounds that are coming to you from this. But in the analogy of a bully, these are not wounds that I necessarily inflict on myself. These aren't my own personal sins, but these are wounds and damage that happened to me at the hands of someone else and their own sinfulness and brokenness, which often happened to them because of other people's woundedness and sinfulness and brokenness. But the beauty of it is that God is there to intervene. God is there to bring healing, to bring freedom, to bring growth and grace in all of these types of suffering. So I hope that these analogies help you understand that suffering doesn't have to be bad. It depends on how you look at it. Sure, each and every one of these things are bad in their own way, but you see the good that God is going to bring out of it. Like even the stove, I willfully sin and do something that God doesn't want me to do. Now, what do I have a sure knowledge of? Stoves are hot, don't touch them. I don't want to do that sin anymore. I've grown. That's also kind of like a little bit of a bike experience. I've hurt myself by doing something that I shouldn't, but I now can grow from that experience. And sometimes when I hurt myself, I can experience God's love in a new way that I wasn't able to experience it before. So each one of these is an opportunity to experience God in a different and new way. So that wraps up this session on Lent and suffering. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have an awesome Lent.